Chapter 1, A Little Fun. Warning, this chapter is violent. Skim the violent areas and skip to the next paragraph for plot if you do not wish to read them. This warning will only appear in applicable chapters. Velvet Scarlatina was happy. She hadn't been this happy in quite a while. As a rabbit fauness, she was picked on and bullied when the teachers weren't looking, and even then a lot of her bullies weren't even punished for the outright racist remarks they made about her physical features or her being a Dumba animal, so when a particularly nasty instigator was caught red-handed while pulling on her ears, Velvet's heart nearly soared with joy as the teacher hauled the student off for detention. Maybe no difference would be made in the long run, but for now, Velvet's immediate problems were solved. Her rabbit ears twitching with excitement, she bounded down the hall on strong legs as she raced to go tell her friend the news. Velvet was by no means a weakling, considering her acceptance into Beacon and her beast heritage, but as one of the ambassadors for the rabbit faunus she had to look harmless and sweet. She also knew that was only part of the reason for her meekness, she just wasn't very confrontational and was actually very kind and passive by nature. That didn't stop her, however, from kicking out fiercely as something slammed into her side and knocked the air out of her lungs. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground as she clutched her stomach, wheezing and trying to draw a breath. Another blow rained down from above, and she managed to glimpse a flash of color before the object brutally slammed into the side of her face, wrenching her neck to the side and shattering her jaw. Nearly unconscious and unable to move her head, Velvet could only stare at the floor passing by her as her assailant dragged her down a small corridor and into an unmarked room. There, Velvet was unceremoniously dumped onto the ground and had her wrists tied and eyes blindfolded. A sudden line of burning pain ran down her chest as something sharp sliced down her uniform and into her skin. Her layers of clothing were peeled off as her attacker leaned in and began kissing and licking the hollow at Velvet's throat. A decidedly feminine body pressed down against her body as the assailant's hands began touching and roaming. Velvet, injured as she was, could only whimper and then scream as another slice came down, cutting a line diagonally across her stomach. More stabs and slicing came as her forced lover leaned down in between each injury to kiss each cut on her belly and then stimulate her entrance. Small hands, lubricated with blood, circled the nubs of Velvet's breasts. The assailant's body pressed against her body, gyrating her skin against Velvet's skin. Without warning, Velvet felt her throat being torn open as small teeth savaged her skin and ripped into her veins. The rabbit girl thrashed and mewed, each sound growing weaker as each cut grew deeper and more frantic. A growing crimson pool spread out around her and smeared her limbs. Even as her vision and mind faded, she heard a moan of ecstasy and pleasure as her assaulter spasmed and released, adding to the growing puddle of fluid surrounding them. Chapter 2, Shaken Up. Yang had been uncharacteristically quiet that morning. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Ruby chirped. "It's nothing, sis. I'll tell you guys later." Yang returned to her brooding mood as her team members looked at each other and shrugged. And so, the brave hunters carved out a niche in the world for us humans to live in. Now, before we all go, I'd like to say a few words to everyone. Pausing for breath, Professor Port looked around. Yesterday afternoon, a student was attacked in one of the hallways near Section 2A. I want you all to be careful, and I'd like to point out that even the strongest aura users can be caught unawares and taken down with a surprise attack. Be vigilant in these troubled times, students. Class dismissed. After he finished speaking, a loud roar built up as students began talking and headed for the exit. Gossip spread and rumors formed, but the 4 members of Team RWBY took no part in this as Yang ushered them towards the back exit, away from the lunchroom. "Where are we going?" Weiss asked. "You guys go back to our room, I want to have a meeting." "I'll grab something for us to eat, what do you guys want?" "I'll have some pasta." "Am I in trouble?" Ruby said. "No sis, this meeting is for everyone." Weiss, Blake, what do you two want? "I'm not too hungry, just get me a salad," Weiss said. Face buried in her book, Blake muttered something about fish and rice. Yang nodded to the 3 and ran off to the cafeteria. Ruby twirled her weapon as they walked down the hall. "I wonder what that was about." Blake shrugged as she read her book, while Weiss had a thoughtful look on face. "Do you think it had anything to do with what Professor Port was talking about?" Weiss asked. "We'll see," said Blake. Rhythmic thumps echoed through the room as Yang gave her punching bag a beating. Her food was untouched and a scowl was on her face. RWBY was chewing her pasta as she watched Young pound the sand-filled sack. Weiss looked a bit upset and wasn't eating, while Blake had her head in her book and ate her fish without watching them. Young turned around and addressed them. "Alright guys, do you know about the attack Professor Peter was talking about?" "Professor Port is the correct way of addressing him, Young," Weiss scolded. Young waved her off and continued talking. "I overheard some of the teachers whispering about what happened. Did you guys know that Velvet Scarlatina was the person attacked?" "The bunny girl?" RWBY asked. "She's a rabbit, not a bunny," Blake said. She had finally put down her book and was looking at Young with an interested expression. "Yeah, that's the one. Apparently, guys, you should probably stop eating for a sec. The attack was incredibly violent. Velvet had her throat ripped out, her right arm was almost torn off, her thigh was cut to the bone, she suffered huge blood loss, her stomach was ripped open, and some of her organs had bites taken out of them." Weiss had put down her salad and was looking paler than usual. Blake's mouth was open in an O shape as she stared with wide eyes at Young. RWBY continued to eat her pasta as she glanced at her teammates. What's worse, though, is that fact that while she was being tortured, Young leaned in, she was being sexually assaulted. Weiss gasped and dropped her fork. Blake had a fury in her expression that Young had never seen before, while RWBY sat there with a bland look on her face. "Are you sure they said that?" Weiss asked with a shocked visage. At the same time, Blake asked, "Do they know who did it?" Young shook her head and said no to both questions. RWBY quietly asked, "Is Velvet still alive?" Young finally was able to put a small smile on her face and answer, "Yes, amazingly she managed to survive. She's getting patched up at the hospital here in our school. Faunus sure are pretty tough. Do you think we could visit her?" Blake inquired. Young shrugged. "Maybe when she regains consciousness, but I don't know how much she'd be able to tell you after going through such a traumatic event." Blake fell silent and digested this information. "Why do you think they haven't told any of the students about what actually happened?" RWBY asked. "They probably don't want to incite panic and have students dropping out of this school," Weiss answered. "The main point though, is that are we safe? I don't think we'll be targeted," RWBY said confidently. "We're all pretty strong and we can take care of ourselves." "What makes you so sure?" asked Weiss. "Remember what Professor Port said. Even the strongest aura users can be attacked while their guard is lowered." Young clapped her hands. "So, back to the point I was trying to talk to you guys about. I want you guys to stay in areas with more people, and I want you guys to keep your auras up at all times." Blake raised an eyebrow. "That's going to be pretty tiring, Young." Young grinned. "Exactly. It serves as training for you guys and you'll be safe. Two birds with one stone. Just make sure not to tire yourself out too much. Alright, that's all I have to say. Anyone want to say anything else?" The girls quietly murmured dissent and sat there in silence, none of them eating. Chapter 3, An Attempt. It had been a few days now. The contentment and fulfillment from RWBY's previous indulgence had worn off quickly, especially upon finding out that the bunny hadn't died. RWBY had greatly underestimated how strong Faunus were. Any human would have died from the amount of injuries the Faunus had sustained. Although Velvet probably wouldn't remember much, RWBY was still worried. "There must be a way I could get rid of her," RWBY thought. "Maybe I'll sabotage her life support machines." RWBY liked that plan. It was late at night. Young and Blake were back in her room, giggling drunkenly over a few bottles of wine Young had managed to sneak in, and trying to get Weiss to drink with them. Weiss was trying to study and getting annoyed. All of them were occupied, and thus no one really cared when RWBY said that she had to go get something from her locker. As RWBY walked through the school, she noticed that most people had their auras up. After Young had called the group meeting, she had then gone to spread her advice out to other students. The students capable of keeping their auras up were nearly always glowing, while those who had weaker auras were usually always near friends. RWBY frowned inwardly as she realized that her pool of potential victims had decreased dramatically. Sure, she could smash through someone's aura or subdue a few people, but it was harder to keep things quiet, and smashing through auras usually damaged the victim too much. She sighed and continued walking. Before going to the hospital wing, she stopped by her locker and picked up her weapon, not bothering to load up ammo. She had to keep things quiet. Upon reaching the doorway of the hospital room, she froze and listened in. There was lots of shouting and arguing occurring, and she didn't want to interrupt anything important. Instead, she pressed her ear to the door and remained silent. What do you mean I can't question her? Of course I can. This is a high-profile incident that could shut down Beacon, and I need to ask her for anything she's seen before she forgets. You, as headmaster, should know the importance of this and be supporting me. There was a cacophony of shouting as nurses tried to assert their opinions. A sharp voice cut through the other voices, quieting them. Nurses, please calm down. Everest, she is currently recuperating and barely able to talk. Her jaw is broken and she has severe blood loss. She has just been stabilized and is currently unconscious. I know you want to capture the villain behind this, but she needs her rest. If you come with me I can get you a place to stay, and perhaps in a few days we can talk to her. Ruby heard some more grumbles, but it seemed that Everest had accepted Professor Ospin's reasoning. Realizing that they were about to leave, Ruby backed away from the door and into a shadowed corner. Ospin and Everest filed out, while some of the nurses also left. Now was probably her best chance. The only nurses left were the night shift ones. Quietly opening the door, she was ecstatic when she realized that nobody was at the help desk. Now she wouldn't have the record of her visit drawing attention to her. Creeping through the hallway, she thanked the gods again upon realizing that the night shift nurses were congregated in the conference room and socializing. Walking down the hallway more confidently now, she scanned the names on the door until she found Velvet Scarlatina's room. The well-oiled hinge of the door did not creak as Ruby turns the doorknob and walked into the darkened room, shutting the door behind her. The only source of illumination was the light of the moon, coming from a small window behind her, so the room was almost completely dark. Velvet was snoring softly, sound asleep. Glancing around, Ruby saw that Velvet wasn't attached to any life support machines. It's the Faunus healing ability, Ruby realized. Velvet had recovered faster than she had expected, and Ruby had no backup plan for making Velvet's death look like an emergency. Ruby realized that she had to do it the old-fashioned way. She took out her weapon and sent a tiny pulse of aura to partially unfold it and expose the blade. The whirs and clicks echoed softly in the small room, but Velvet's ears twitched anyway and she bolted upright, clutching her thin blanket and glancing around. Hello. Who's there? Ruby was nearly within striking distance when Velvet finally looked behind her. Both of them froze for a fraction of a second, eyes staring into each other's, before Velvet began to scream. Ruby was swinging her weapon instantly, but now that the Faunus was aware of Ruby's location, Velvet landed a lightning-fast and powerful kick that struck Ruby's left bicep directly, eliciting a muffled grunt and deadening Ruby's arm and fingers, causing her to drop her weapon. Ruby could barely see anything as Velvet scooted off the bed and out of the illumination of the window. Unfortunately for Ruby, Faunus had extremely good night vision and Velvet was no exception. Ruby frantically searched for her weapon with her right hand, trying to find it before Velvet could escape. However, when she finally found it and looked up, Velvet was in mid-air, launching a spinning kick with her powerful legs that slammed into Ruby's chest and sent Ruby flying back into the shelves of medical equipment. Glass shards and metal instruments flew everywhere, and at that moment Ruby was glad that her aura protected her against those sharp pieces. Groaning, she sat up and watched as Velvet flew out the door, crying for help. Ruby had to make a quick exit. Smashing her scythe into the window, she scraped out the sharp glass from the frame before jumping through. On the way down, Ruby stabbed her the blade of her scythe into the wall, slowing her down before impacting the ground. There was now a deep, long gouge in the outside of the building from the third floor to the first floor, but there was nothing Ruby could do about it now. Running in the bushes outside of the school buildings, she circled the main building and jumped the wall into the courtyard. She entered through one of the courtyard doors and slowed down, calming herself and walking casually. Yang and Blake were drunkenly arguing about whose weapon was better, while Weiss had earplugs in and was trying to focus on her schoolwork. They looked at Ruby as Ruby walked in. "Did ya get what ya needed, my cute little sis?" Yang smiled as she drunkenly slurred. Blake had collapsed onto her shoulder and was trying to hug her. "Yup. I just wanted to get my sweetheart." Ruby smiled as she cuddled her weapon. She went to the bathroom to take a shower and prepare for bed. "Sometimes, I think she's a little too obsessed with that weapon of hers," Yang whispered conspiratorially to Blake. Blake just giggled and cuddled closer to Yang, planting a discreet kiss on her collarbone and giving her cheek a lick. Yang looked around, and seeing that Ruby was in the shower and Weiss had fallen asleep on her textbook, she turned around, straddling Blake, and returned the cat girl's kiss. Blake had begun to squirm a hand under Yang's clothes when Ruby came back out of the bathroom. Giving a little sigh, they quickly broke apart and pretended that nothing was happening. Tomorrow was Saturday, and they could sneak off together for some more alone time. Chapter 4, Where is Love? Warning, this chapter contains a bit of lemon. Her assassination attempt had failed. Ruby was mopey and depressed, and her team members had noticed. They tried various things to cheer her up, from new headphones to her favorite foods, but they didn't realize that Ruby just needed someone to be with her, someone to love, and Ruby herself was silent on that topic. A week after her failed attempt, Ruby was beginning to crack. Maybe Yang or Blake or Weiss will love me, she thought to herself. Maybe one of them could fill that hole in her heart and she wouldn't have to kill people anymore. Maybe. I need to go talk to them. It was Saturday morning, and Blake had already gotten up and left to get food. Yang was snoring on her bed, while Weiss was taking a shower. Ruby walked over to Yang and shook her shoulder gently. Hey, Yang. Yeah, sis. She muttered tiredly. Can't you let me sleep a little bit longer? I will. Just let me ask you something. Do you love me? Ruby, dressed in her thin, stretchy top pajamas and boy shorts, had crawled into Yang's bed and was gently caressing Yang's hard stomach. Stop it. That tickles. Yang murmured. Of course I love you. You're my favorite little sister. Ruby let out a little sigh and hugged Yang closer. That wasn't the answer she was looking for, but how much could Ruby hope for? They had been adoptive sisters for years now, and Yang had always treated her as a real, biological sister. There was no hope of that love developing into something even deeper. Yang passionately kissed Blake as they rolled around in one of the more secluded gardens of the school. It was just after lunch, and Yang had told Ruby and Weiss that she was going to hang out with friends. That wasn't a lie, really, Yang told herself as she flipped herself on top of Blake. There was rarely a moment they could be alone together, and so this Saturday hangout time had become something of a regular occurrence. They weren't really sure how others would react to their same-sex relationship, so they kept their affections mostly under wrap and hidden away. Blake began stripping off her clothes even as they continued to kiss, their tongues sliding against each other's and their hands roaming over each other's bodies. Yang reached down through Blake's shorts and began stroking Blake's soaking core, inciting small purrs as her bestial nature slipped out. At the same time, Yang reached upwards and undid the bow on Blake's head, stroking her soft, furry ears. In one fluid motion, Yang yanked off Blake's shorts and stockings. She moved downwards and began kissing the areas around her wetness, prompting Blake to grasp her hair and push her head down into her mound. Yang obliged and began licking her slit and nibbling on her bundle of nerves, gently building Blake up to a release. Blake moaned as she shuddered, coming closer to an orgasm and grasping Yang's hair even tighter. The moment Yang began to thrust her fingers into Blake's entrance and stimulate her G-spot, Blake began to spasm and come, locking her legs around Yang's head and holding Yang to her core. Her depths were on fire as Yang's fingers continued to relentlessly thrust and her tongue continued to lick, encouraging Blake to cry out Yang's name. A few minutes later, Yang sat back up as Blake was eagle spread on the ground, still twitching and smiling. Yang stripped off the rest of her clothes and leaned into Blake, giving her another kiss and holding her tight. Come on, Blake, Yang breathed into her ear. It's your turn. It was nighttime. Ruby had passed the afternoon working in the training room and trying to exhaust away her depression. Walking back to her dorm room, she met Blake and Yang in hallway heading towards their suite. Hey Ruby, before we go to dinner, can I say something to you and Weiss? Yang asked. Huh, sure, Yang. Did something happen again? No, nothing like that. I just want to clear something up with you and Weiss. Ruby noticed Blake giving a discreet little hug to Yang, and Yang looking back down and smiling. They arrived in their room and sat down on the couch waiting for Weiss to arrive. A few minutes later, Weiss appeared, arms filled with books and paper, stumbling into the room. When Ruby got up and offered to help, Weiss smiled gratefully at her. Ruby's heart stuttered from the image of Weiss's beautiful face filling her vision, and she nearly fell flat on her face. When Yang was sure that they were both watching, she got up, pulling Blake with her, and gave her a long kiss. Ruby's jaw dropped open while Weiss just smiled. Me and Blakey here don't want to hide our relationship anymore. I just wanted to be the first one to tell you guys that. Weiss's smile only grew as she saw how much they loved each other. Yang noticed and asked, Weiss, why are you smiling so much? I noticed a long time ago, and I'm really glad you guys decided to go public with your feelings. Did you really think that I, Weiss Schnee, would fall asleep while studying? I'm not like Ruby here, she scoffed. Ruby's heart grew brittle as she saw how many around her had found love. Still, she tried to be happy for them. Giving the brightest smile she could muster, Ruby exclaimed, that's great. Upon hearing Ruby's acceptance, Yang smiled and kissed Blake again. You guys can use one of the guest rooms to do that, Weiss pointed out. Blake grabbed Yang's hand and smiled wickedly, dragging Yang into one of the guest rooms and shutting the door. We'll come down for dinner so MMF. Yang tried to say. Weiss shook her head. Come on, Ruby, let's go get some food. Hey Weiss, do you have anyone you like? Ruby ventured cautiously. To her surprise, Weiss actually began to blush and tried to hide her flushing cheeks with her collar. Maybe. Weiss said. Ruby attempted to smile and didn't delve deeper. She actually just wanted to scream and shout and cry, and she couldn't trust her voice at that moment. How did love find everyone but pass by her? She couldn't take it anymore. Weiss, go on without me. I just remembered that I had to do something. Ruby tried to put a neutral expression on her face, but she knew that her facade was quickly crumbling. Weiss, still blushing and lost in her thoughts, nodded and walked on without Ruby. The moment Weiss was out of sight, Ruby sprinted to an empty classroom, ran in, and locked the door. School was over for the day, and most students were out at lunch and wouldn't return until later. Wrapping her cloak around herself, Ruby sat down in a corner and sobbed. Chapter 5 Discovered. Blake was sitting in the garden, enjoying the sunlight and reading a book on the warm stone bench. It was Sunday morning, and she had just woken up after an exhausting night with Yang. The sound of a cough shattered her tranquility, making her glance up and take note of her surroundings. A man with dark hair and ordinary features stepped forward. He was wearing a light blue suit and a red tie, with a white undershirt and dress shoes. Professor Ospin has requested your presence in the hospital wing. He would like to meet you there at 12 o'clock sharp. I trust you do not have other plans. No. I'll be there. Blake glanced back down at her book. The man coughed again, making Blake grimace and look up again. One last thing, Ospin said that it had to deal with the incident of an assault on the Faunus girl, Velvet Scarlatina. Upon hearing this, Blake slammed her book shut and stood up. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's go. It's already 11:30, I can wait a bit for Professor Ospin. Accepting her sudden burst of enthusiasm, the man led the way to the hospital wings. I said Professor Ospin would like to see you at 12 in the hospital. Please listen to me. Weiss was attempting to paint the beautiful entrance of Beacon Academy. Setting down her brush, she whirled to face the annoyance. What do you want? Startled, the woman backed up a few steps. She had brown hair and a pretty face, and was wearing a black suit with long pants, a white undershirt, a blue tie, and black heels. She frowned. Once again, Professor Ospin has requested your presence in the hospital wing at 12 o'clock. It is nearly 11:50, I suggest you start walking now. Grumbling, Weiss began packing up her supplies. Yang grunted as she deadlifted the massive weight. Squatting down, she grabbed the bar and ignited her aura, small flames beginning to flicker on her arms. With an intake of breath, she heaved. The door to the weightlifting room suddenly burst open, slamming into the wall and almost causing Yang to drop her weight. A frazzled young man, with red hair and wearing a disheveled shirt and tie, burst in, gasping for breath. I'm so sorry, you're so hard to find, and I. Yang growled and interrupted him. Pulling the weight up the full distance, she finished her set and gently placed the weight back onto the floor. Alright, let's go. Wah. You don't even know what I'm here for. You are sweaty and messy, and you look like you're late. You clearly come bring me to someone or tell me something, so spit it out and let's go. Oh okay. Ospin wanted to see you at 12 o'clock in the hospital wing, but it's already 12:10 and we're late. Yang sighed, and then thought about it. This could be a fun challenge. Hey, do you use aura? Yes. Why do you ask? Yang grinned. Try to keep up. They heard her before she actually got to them. Surprised squeals and the sound of quick footsteps preceded Young as she appeared around the corner and ran towards the reception area, where Weiss and Blake and Ozpin had been impatiently waiting. Leaving behind a trail of fire and wearing nothing but a tank top and sweatpants, Young was one of the most beautiful sights Blake had ever seen as Young picked her up without stopping, bent her over, and deeply kissed her. Blake was breathless and panting when Young broke off the kiss. Upon witnessing this scene, Ozpin merely raised an eyebrow and said nothing. "So, what are we here for?" Weiss asked. Ozpin motioned for them to follow him and began talking. Velvet Scarlatina, the student who was attacked, was nearly killed again a week ago when the attacker came back to finish her job. Velvet now remembers some details about her last encounter with the assailant, and wishes to speak with you three. Female. That can't be right, Weiss said. At the same time, Yang asked, "Just us three?" Blake had a worried frown on her face and clutched Yang's hand. Yang gave her a comforting smile and squeezed back. "Yes. She's already spoken to me, and I believe you three may want to hear this." Opening the door to Velvet's room, Ozpin waved them in and shut the door behind him. Velvet was sitting upright on the bed, seemingly fine, but upon closer inspection it was clear that she was shivering with terror and sniffling. Ozpin gently asked Velvet to tell them what she saw. "It was very dark, but I'm a Faunus S so I can see well in the dark, and I think I saw." They left the room arguing among themselves. "It's crazy to suspect Ruby. Have you even seen her hurt anyone?" Yang shouted. "Have you even seen her hunt Grim?" "Yang, she scares me a lot. A few weeks ago, when we were on a training expedition, she chopped off all but an arm on a Beowulf and let it crawl away for a bit. Then she took her scythe and sliced off its snout, blinded both its eyes, and then beat the poor thing to death with the blunt end of her scythe. I didn't say anything because I thought she just really didn't like Beowulfs, but now." Weiss trailed off. Blake interjected. "It was all very hush-hush and covered up by the government, but I think that the general rumor is that her parents were killed by Beowulfs. Ruby survived by covering herself in her parents' blood and playing dead. Even then, she was severely injured and barely managed to send a call for help on a message signal before collapsing. And then, as you know, Yang's family adopted her." Yang usually would have smiled at the last statement, but right now she was worried. "See, just because she kills Beowulfs violently doesn't mean that she hurts people," Yang said. "Actually," Blake interrupted again, "the torturing of animals is a common trait in murderers and psychopaths." Yang frowned and fell silent. "No matter what, as students of Beacon Academy, I still think that we have a responsibility to observe Ruby and see if she is responsible for these crimes. I know Ozpin didn't tell us to do anything specifically, but I think he gave us the information to make the decision ourselves," Weiss said. Yang was extremely reluctant, but after a few minutes of arguing and guilting she had to agree with them. Walking down the hallway, Yang and Weiss were discussing how they would spy on Ruby when Blake suddenly stopped and stared. Yang and Weiss stumbled, almost tripping on Blake. "I think I hear something," Blake said, as the bow on her head twitched and swiveled. "Follow me." With a sudden burst of speed, Blake dashed down the hall. Yang and Weiss gave each other a glance and raced after her. Ruby had fallen asleep in the classroom, safe in the comforting curtain of her cloak. She had woken up at midnight and stumbled back to her dorm room, where Blake and Yang were already asleep and Weiss was about to get into bed. Ruby had muttered something about an extra credit assignment and Weiss didn't ask for details. It seemed that her friends had been growing further away from her after Ruby had realized that each of them already had their own relationships. That night she had tried to snuggle up with Yang for comfort as she sometimes did, but Ruby had realized that Blake was already sleeping with Yang. Seeing that, another crack had appeared in Ruby's ruin of a heart-in. Ruby returned to her own bed. Now she knew that she had no friends anymore. She was alone and abandoned and her heart was empty and broken. She needed someone to fill it. After her roommates had left to pursue their own leisure activities, Ruby slipped out and waited until lunchtime, when most of the students would be out getting food. Ruby had been waiting by the bathroom for a few minutes when a cute little cat boy finally came out. This was what she was waiting for. She was so lonely, she needed someone to be with her. Swathing him in her cloak before he could react, she knotted it around his neck and choked him. Picking him up, she dashed to one of the empty classrooms. The boy had gone unconscious after being unable to breathe, but now woke up after Ruby broke his wrist and tore it off, using the sharp piece of bone to cut through his skin. She then moved onto his knees, dismembering him piece by piece. His wailing cries finally stopped after Ruby stabbed a shard of what was once his arm bone into his throat. She gouged his eyes out and licked his nose. Firmly grasping his jaw, she licked around his mouth, savoring the taste of his skin before ripping his jawbone out of his head. This prompted another round of gurgling from the cat boy. She grasped his tongue with her fingers and sucked it and bit it off. Chewing on the tough piece of meat, she thought, "I'm finally kissing someone now," before giggling and swallowing it. Slicing through his ribcage, she firmly grasped both edges of it and ripped his chest open. Resting her cheek against the still beating heart in the unconscious boy's body, Ruby was glad that the sturdy constitution of the faunus let her savor the warm pulse of a living heart, something that she craved. Blood pounding in her head and her nether regions burning with lust, she blew out a warm breath onto his heart before taking a bite of it and ripping out a chunk with her teeth. It was delicious and fulfilling. At that moment, she felt warm and comforted, heat expanding around her as if she were curled up next to the body of a lover. She let her guard down, releasing her hold on her aura and letting herself feel exposed and vulnerable. She gave a soft smile as she felt the steamy warmth of the body swirl around her, caressing her bare skin. She breathed in the delicious scent of a warm, bloody body and shuddered with ecstasy. Then, the moment passed. She ripped the heart out his chest and prepared to take another bite. The door exploded with a swirling of fiery shotgun blasts and red, blue, and green bursts of dust-fueled explosions. Catching Ruby unawares and with her aura down, the bullet slammed into her chest and stomach, tearing through her thin dress and corset. The powerful dust explosions knocked her back and crushed her against the wall, wrenching her arm into an awkward position and shattering her left forearm. Ruby gave a small cry of pain and curled up into a ball on the ground. Three figures stepped through the smoke and destruction. "Ruby!" Young gasped, seeing the red-cloaked figure bleeding out on the ground. Her heart skipped a beat upon seeing the ruined body next to Ruby. "Oh my!" was all Wise could say before faltering and falling to her knees, dry retching. Blake gave a yowl of distress upon seeing the cat boy's body on the floor. With a burst of movement, Blake flashed to Ruby's side, grabbing hold of her cloak and pushing her up against the wall. Unable to form words, Blake screamed incoherently at Ruby and began smashing her repeatedly against the wall. With a sudden flash of deep red aura, Ruby vanished from Blake's grip, leaving a behind fistful of rose petals. Young and Weiss, standing there with shocked expressions and staring the body, did not immediately notice Ruby appear behind them and run off towards the doorway. Blake screeched at them and pointed towards the exit before chasing after Ruby. Ruby's breath came out in small gasps and she gave out unwilling whimpers of pain. Disappearing and reappearing in bursts down the hallway, she used the recoil on her side to propel herself between each dash. As she moved, she wildly slashed out against the walls and ceilings of the hallway, bringing down rubble behind her to slow down her pursuers. The people she passed by in the reception area stood still in shock as a bloody girl in bloody clothes clutching gaping wounds in her side and chest dashed past them, leaving behind a trail of blood. Ruby was in a lot of trouble and a lot of pain. The mental anguish of allowing her friends to see her like this was repressed as she dealt with her more immediate concerns of blood loss, internal damage, and a broken arm. Making it into the main entrance, she passed the slack-jawed receptionist and in two quick motions, sliced the hinges of the door and kicked the door down. Sunlight illuminated her as she continued to run, heading for the deep, dark forest. Chapter 6: Run, Run, Run. Blake growled as she paced around the edge of the forest. By the time the three had arrived, Ruby had been long gone. They simply could not keep up with Ruby's speed and agility, and when they got to the area all that remained were a few bloodstains on the trees at the border of the forest. Clearly, Ruby had bound her wounds with her cloak to prevent much blood from leaking. "How far do you think she could go?" Young asked worriedly. Weiss shrugged and continued looking into the dark copse of woods. "I got her pretty good with my dust explosions, and we both took her by surprise with her aura down. Frankly, I'm not even sure how she's still able to move." In a blur, a group of black-suited, helmet-wearing academy guards raced past them and towards the woods. Following them was Glinda Goodwitch, who was alternating between shouting directions and glancing down at her tablet. With a final instruction, the guards disappeared into the shadowy thicket and Glinda turned back to them. Glinda tapped her tablet, bringing up a video of Ruby covered in blood dashing down the hallway with the trio chasing her. The video cut abruptly after Ruby collapsed the walls and floor, the screen flickering in static and then blacking out. What happened? You've clearly been fighting Ruby, so I sent a squad of guards to apprehend her and bring her back. The Emerald Forest is no place for a novice even during the day. Yang looked like she was about to cry. She choked out. We found out that Ruby was the one who attacked Velvet. What? How? Are you sure? Blake stepped in with an angry expression on her face. Yes, we're completely sure, she spit out. We found her killing another Faunus, a boy this time. He's in one of the empty classrooms in section 1E. Glinda stared at them for a second, then started quickly tapping on her tablet. There's a body in section 1E. The assailant has gone into the Emerald Forest. I've sent 10 guards after her. A deep voice came out of the tablet. Who was it? The victim has not been identified. The assailant was Ruby Rose, first-year novice. There was a pause. The voice spoke again. Understood. Do you want to keep this quiet? Yes. Don't send any warnings, I don't want any nearby towns to panic. I'm sure our guards will apprehend her soon. Ruby doesn't know the forest as well as they do. Your choice. The conversation ended. Glinda looked back up at the three girls, who had been listening intently to the exchange. Now, would you three please bring me to the site of the murder? Let my guards do the chasing, I want to hear more details about this situation. The three reluctantly nodded and headed back into the school. Stumbling wildly through the underbrush, Ruby's aura flickered on and off. She was nearly completely exhausted, and was unable to use her aura to dash any longer. Just keeping a hold onto her aura was nearly impossible. Walking drunkenly, she resorted to slumping on trees and resting for a bit whenever her strength failed her. Her vision was getting blurry, and the only way she was able to keep herself moving in a straight line was by following some old King Taijutsu snake tracks. A voice blared through the trees. Stop moving. Remain where you are. We have surrounded your position and you are in our sights. Place your weapon on the ground and put your hands in the air. You have 10 seconds before we fire. 10. Her thoughts moved sluggishly as she tried to comprehend what was going on. 9. Ruby's heartbeat raced, adrenaline spiking through her system as her body tried to push itself even further. 8. With the adrenaline, Ruby's thoughts gained sudden clarity. Her vision sharpened and her injuries seemed less painful. 7. She had to come up with a plan. 6. Her weapon had 8 rounds left, the other 22 bullets had been used in her escape from Beacon. 5. She tightened her grip on the trigger as she glanced down at the snake tracks. 4. She knew what she had to do. 3. Ruby crouched as if meaning to set down her weapon. I'm surrendering, Ruby rasped. She was sure one of her lungs was leaking. All right, miss, after placing your weapon on the ground, put your hands up into the air. The man on the loudspeaker cursed as Ruby suddenly moved. With 3 violent shots, she propelled herself to the right, straight up, and then to the left. Landing on a tree limb, her legs nearly collapsed as she aggravated her injuries. Only adrenaline and the last dregs of her aura were keeping her up now. Taking a deep breath, she used one more shot to give herself momentum and began jumping from tree to tree. Bullets sprayed the areas where she had been moments before. Ruby gritted her teeth as she continued to move. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Letting herself fall from a tree branch, she fell onto the ground and landed on her side. She involuntarily coughed up a bit of blood when her right lung began to fill with fluid. Moving slowly, she propped herself up onto her knees with her side, unable to raise her head. 10 black-clad guards appeared one by one into the clearing Ruby was collapsed in. They began to circle her, weapons out and ready to fire, intent on making sure she didn't escape. Blondie, Jack, Max, Bill, move behind her and make sure she doesn't try to run for that cave entrance. The 4 guards fanned out behind Ruby, blocking the dark hole in the side of the cliff. The leader of the group brought out a pair of thin, silver-color handcuffs, his distinguishable features obscured by his helmet. His voice sounded strangely robotic. I am going to place these handcuffs on you. Do not move, or we will obligated to use force. However, before he could get within arm-length distance of Ruby, a loud rumbling noise began emanating from the cave entrance. The leader turned to face this new sound. What the? Before he could finish his sentence, a pair of white and black king taijutsu snakes, each a thick rope of coiled muscle at least 50 feet long and covered in gleaming armor-like scales, burst out of the cave entrance and engulfed the 4 guards behind RWBY before they could make a sound. Jaws snapping down, the guards were violently folded backwards in the snakes' mouths before their spines snapped and their bellies ripped open, a glimpse of colored entrails visible before the gaping maws slammed shut. The leader swore and reached behind his back, pulling out a double-bladed sword that unfolded into a compound bow, and notched a gleaming black arrow. He turned back to tell the girl to stay put, but she was already gone. He cursed again and began shooting. RWBY was now truly, finally on her last legs. She tripped on a rock and rolled down an incline, finally stopping upon hitting a tree. RWBY was sure that impact had just broken something else, but she ignored it and began crawling forwards. After another 15 minutes of dragging herself along, she began to see a bit of light in the distance. Foot by foot, inch by inch, her hands grasped the grass underneath her and then the rocks and soil as she clawed herself onto the pathway of a small cottage. The windows emitted a soft glow, encouraging RWBY to continue moving. Finally, she reached the doorstep. Bending her knees and curling up into a fetal position, she then used both legs to feebly kick at the wooden entryway of the house. After several agonizing moments, the door opened. RWBY managed to cough out a soft protest. "No hospital, please." And then she fainted. Chapter 7, Doe, a Deer. RWBY blinked groggily, sunlight filtering through the windows and bringing tears to her slitted eyes. She ached all over, the pain from the bullet wounds like sharp knives, lancing through her with every breath she took. Her left forearm was in a cast, but she could still move her elbow and her fingers. A gentle touch caressed her hair, fingers threading through the messy strands that were spread out on the bed. The unexpected touch immediately woke her up. RWBY opened her eyes completely, and the first thing she saw were a pair of brown doe ears, the velvet texture lending them a soft appearance. Shifting her gaze, she was suddenly looking into a delicate, pale face, filled with big almond-shaped eyes, a little button nose, and soft and pink lips. The doe faunus face was framed with silky, light auburn locks with curls that cascaded over her shoulders and down her chest. RWBY's heart nearly stopped as she looked upon the cutest thing she had ever seen. And then her heart started beating again, even faster when she remembered that she was on the run. Before the doe faunus could react, RWBY had one hand wrapped around the doe's throat and the other gripping the bottom of her jaw. Just a small twist and RWBY would be safe. It was a shame to kill someone as beautiful as her, but RWBY couldn't risk the chance of being discovered. However, killing her would also create questions when she stopped showing up in town. Both of them were still, the doe faunus frozen with fright and RWBY considering her options. Looking more closely at the faunus, RWBY noticed that she was wearing a nurse's uniform, a modest white dress with short sleeves, a cute little cap on her head, and small apron that was wrapped around her waist. The doe was the first one to talk. "Hi, are you awake now? Why, your hair is so pretty, the way it goes from black to red at the T-tips." She blushed and tried to look away, but RWBY's hands were still firmly grasping her small throat and jawbone. RWBY tried to respond. "Oh, thank you. See, can you let me go now?" She squeaked. "Oops. Sorry." RWBY exclaimed, releasing her hold on the doe's neck. The faunus immediately backed up, tripping over her own feet and falling onto her little bottom, letting out a little gasp. RWBY tried to get off the bed. "Here, let me help you unch." After temporarily forgetting about her injuries, RWBY's pain returned with a vengeance as her legs failed her and she fell off the bed, landing right next to the faunus. It was at this point that she realized she was wearing nothing but a sports bra and boy shorts. Her face flushed as she tried to stand back up. The doe faunus had her hands over her mouth as she watched RWBY tumble off the bed. "Be careful," she cried. She quickly got to her feet and pulled RWBY back up and onto the bed. RWBY said thanks, and gave her an embarrassed smile. "So, where am I?" The doe faunus straightened out her dress and sat down on the chair next to her. "This is my house," she said with a smile. "I live on the edge of the town. A lot of people don't really like faunus, so I live here, alone. My dad died a few years ago and left this place to me. This was the only home I had ever known, so I finished my education at one of the nursing schools and I've just begun to work as a pharmacist and nurse at the town medical center. Sorry, I seem to be rambling a little. Wait, how old are you? The faunus ducked her head and her face heated up. I'm only 17, but I was a pretty good student so they let me skip ahead a few grades. Even though I only have a little aura, I can use it to encourage the healing of injuries, so they took me on as a nurse. Whoa, that's awesome, Ruby said in wonder. Is that why I'm not dead? The doe blinked at Ruby's straightforward question. Well, partially, but I can't take all the credit. Your aura is pretty strong, so you only needed a little of my help before you were able to pull through and start healing quickly on your own. It's only been 3 days, and you're already able to move. Patients with weaker auras would probably have been in bed for at least 2 weeks, if not more. Your left arm, however, was shattered and had a nasty compound fracture. You should refrain from using it until it heals up. Also, she said more quietly, you kept muttering, no hospital, please, after I brought you in, so I just treated you here. I'm glad you're okay. Ruby realized how lucky she had been. If she had gone to anyone else, she was sure they would have ignored her and taken her to the hospital, where she would have been recognized and arrested. Immediately she began to feel depressed as she remembered her friend's horrified expressions and Blake's fury. The doe began speaking again, breaking Ruby out of her reverie. I can't believe I forgot to give you my name. Hi, I'm Allison, she said, smiling and extending her hand. Ruby took her hand and grasped it, smiling back. Call me Red. That's an odd name, but I think it fits you pretty well, Allison said. Especially considering you came to my doorstep covered in blood. Ruby's face immediately took on a neutral expression. I don't really want to talk about it, she said quietly. Allison nodded her understanding. Hey, Allison is really long. Can I just call you Alice? Ruby said as her smile returned. Alice nodded again. She had been alone for many years, and there weren't many faunus who lived in human towns such as this one. Finding a companion, especially one that was so close to her own age, was unexpected and delightful. She understood Ruby's need for privacy, as a lot of her own patients had requested the same thing after traumatic experiences, so she didn't pry further. Perhaps finally, she could make a friend. Alice is fine, she said, smiling and standing up. It's nearly lunchtime, and I'm going to go make some food. Are you hungry? Ruby's stomach growled at the reminder of food. Definitely, I'm starving. Alice had to leave right after lunch to go back to work. They had just finished a lunch of rice and vegetable soup, with Ruby eating in bed and Alice sitting next to her. Sorry, she said apologetically, I've been using up my sick leave days and I need to go back to work. Do you need anything? Ruby immediately felt guilty. Oh shoot, I forgot you had a job. I'll be fine, I can just sit and rest. Oh, and this might sound weird, but yes. Alice was hopping from foot to foot, clearly urgent to leave. Could you buy me some leather, fabric, and red and black dye? I think I need to patch up my ruined clothes. Oh. Yes, your clothes were in tatters, but I salvaged what I could. They're on the clothesline out back, wait a second, let me get them. In a flash, Alice went out to get the clothes and came back in 20 seconds, panting. Here, she said, holding up what was vaguely recognizable as Ruby's cape and dress, these are your old clothes. These, Alice raised up a pink t-shirt, folded running pants, and sneakers you can wear right now. I can buy you some more underclothes tonight when I get from my shift. Ruby smiled and thanked her, and checked the clock. Alice. It's 1:30. When do you need to get there by? Alice gasped. I should have been arriving by now. She threw the clothes onto the bedside table and sprinted out of the room. Now, how am I supposed to put these clothes on? Ruby thought to herself. Sighing, she once again tried to get off the bed. After half an hour of struggling and nearly screaming in pain, Ruby managed to put her on her sweatpants and t-shirt with her one arm. She carefully stepped off the bed, mindful of her trembling thighs, and started walking around, trying to exercise her unused muscles. A thought suddenly shattered her calm. Where is my weapon? Did Alice see it? Ruby began panicking. Disregarding the amount of pain she was in, she stumbled around the small cottage, frantically searching for her precious high-caliber sniper scythe. After a fruitless search around the house, she ran back to her room and tugged on her sneakers. Opening the door, she rushed outside and began retracing the route she had escaped by. It wasn't hard, considering the large smears of blood she had left behind her while crawling her way to the door. Walking back and forth, she noticed that she had started crawling with both hands sometime after rolling into the tree. Crouching down and combing the area carefully, she found her scythe folded up underneath a bush, looking no worse for wear. It would probably need some lubricant and a sharpening, considering the amount of use she had put it through in the past few weeks, but it was otherwise undamaged. Ruby clutched her weapon to her chest, caressing its smooth, hard exterior, and savoring its feel. She needed to hide it somewhere. Bringing it into Alice's small house and keeping it hidden would be an impossible task, and its discovery would raise too many questions. Ruby thought about it for a while, and then had an idea. She walked back up the hill she had rolled down, going a little deeper into the forest. There, stopping at a large boulder, she brought up her aura, flaring it as strongly as possible, and unfolded her scythe. Ruby slammed her scythe into the side of the boulder, and began carving. A few minutes later, she had created a square-shaped hole in the side of the boulder. Slabs of stone littered the ground beside her. Refolding her scythe, Ruby shoved the scythe as deeply into the boulder as possible, then picked up each of the slabs and shoved them back in. As a final touch, she took a bit of gray mud and smeared it into the small indentation her carving had left. Ruby stepped back proud of her work. The boulder looked untouched, and only Ruby knew where it was. Satisfied and exhausted, Ruby walked back to the cottage to see if she could begin repairing her clothes. What do you mean that they're Mia and most likely dead? Where the hell is the rest of your team? The man who was the leader of the Beacon Academy guards now stood in front of Glinda, one arm in a sling and leaning on a crutch. Now, his helmet was heavily dented, the tinted display at the front cracked. The sword bow strapped to his back was broken in half, one end nothing but a mass of splintered metal. His quiver was empty and his uniform was ripped in several places. Black and red blood stained the front of his uniform. We miscalculated, ma'am. She led us straight to a taijutsu nest, and 2 50-foot black and whites engaged us. They took out 4 of us in a surprise attack, but we managed to take the 2 down with only 1 additional loss. What we did not expect, however, was the 35 or so 20-foot baby taijutus that burst out of the white taijutsu's belly. We stood and fought, but eventually we were overrun. I'm the only one who managed to get away. I accept full responsibility and I will take any punishment you deem fit. Glinda palmed her face and sighed. Stand down, soldier. You are not to blame for this mess. I assume that the target escaped during the fighting. Yes, ma'am. Return to bed and take 2 weeks off for recovery. Use that time to begin recruiting new guards. Thank you, ma'am. The man began limping back to the hospital wing. Glinda tapped the surface of her tablet. Ruby escaped, stated the man in a monotone. Yes, sighed Glinda. What do you think we should do? Was Ruby severely injured? Yes, the video shows her holding a presumably broken arm, with 2 bullet wounds in her chest and 2 bullet wounds in her stomach. Judging by the bloodstains, she suffered copious blood loss and could have gone unconscious at any time. Good, then. Send out teams to search for her body. I highly doubt she survived the night in the forest. Now all we need is visual confirmation of her death. What if we don't find the body? Then we'll put up posters and spread the word to neighboring towns. But I still think she died in the forest, and we don't need to cause the other towns to unnecessarily panic. Glinda rubbed her eyes tiredly. I hope you're right. Chapter 8, Lust and Love. Ruby had settled into a routine. She would wake up in the morning and help Alice around the house and prepare breakfast. Sometimes, she went to go pick up Alice from the hospital at night after her shift had ended. They chatted about their day and various interesting events as they walked back to the cottage. The threat of discovery, however, was always on Ruby's mind. Whenever she went out shopping, she wore a deep hoodie that covered her hair and shadowed her facial features. She never volunteered any information about where she lived and what she did, preferring to remain silent. There was one close call, however, when she nearly was discovered by Weiss. Ruby and Alice were walking home and passed by the dust store, nearly bumping into Weiss as she walked out of the door. Thinking quickly, Ruby grabbed Alice and buried her face into the Alice chest, pretending to hug her and hiding her face from view as Weiss scolded them for their carelessness. However, upon realizing that the 2 of them looked like they were occupied, Weiss blushed and quickly began to walk away. Alice's face was red and her steps a little unsteady as Ruby pulled out of the hug and started walking home. What was that? Alice asked in an embarrassed tone. Ruby looked away and hunched down a little. I guess I was feeling a little lonely, she said, letting a hint of sadness enter her voice. Alice seemed disappointed as they resumed their previous conversation and walked back home. As for Ruby's previous clothing, it had been unsalvageable. The blood-soaked cloth had fallen apart in her hands, seeming as if the night she had spent in the wet forest had rotted the fibers. Thus, she began to work on a new set of clothing, made out of more sturdy material. Alice had given her the cloth, leather, and dye she needed, and Ruby felt guilty about asking Alice to spend her money on these things. Ruby was not lacking money, as her parents had left her a sizable inheritance and a bank account that she seldom used, but it was currently inaccessible because her Master Lean card was hidden in her dorm room back at Beacon, so she resorted to telling herself that she would pay Alice back when she had access to her bank account again. One day, Alice brought home a shopping bag containing a flat little box. "It's a tablet," Alice said proudly, grinning and unwrapping it. She slid her slender fingers across the screen, causing the tablet to emit a beep and flicker on. "I can read the news on it, play games with it, and best of all, it's solar-powered." Alice's delight was infectious, bringing a smile to Ruby's face. Ruby remembered seeing Glinda using a similar tablet, albeit slightly larger. She understood Alice's delight at the eco-friendly way of charging, as Alice's house wasn't connected to any power lines due to the remoteness of the location. Alice had already started playing a game, the colorful lights splashing across the screen, when Ruby realized something. "Hey Alice, could I see that for a second?" Alice looked up. "Oh. Sorry. I've really wanted to play this game for a very long time," she said wistfully, "and I just saved up enough lean to buy this tablet." Ruby frantically waved her hands. No, it's totally fine, I just want to check something on the news. It'll only take a few seconds, promise." Alice reluctantly gave up the tablet. "It's okay, I'll go change and prepare dinner, take as much time as you need," she said, walking out of the room. Ruby quickly opened up the news application, praying that this program was the same as the one she had used on the desktop version of the tablet. She definitely wasn't out of touch with technology, having used the desktop tablet to model her side when she was designing and building it, but she hadn't used one of the mobile versions before. A few quick motions later, she had opened up the developer console and began to modify the news filters. With the 3 lines of instructions, she told the program not to display any news articles containing the words "Ruby" and "Rose" used in conjunction. Setting a password lock on the console and exiting out of it, she was finally able to exhale a sigh of relief. "Hey Alice, I'm done now. You can have it back." Rushing in, Alice snatched it out of her hands and quickly began to play the game again. 2 weeks passed. Ruby was getting more than a little itchy, her urge to indulge popping up again and again, only being satisfied temporarily when she pretended that she was loved and pleasured herself in bed. Each passing day drew upon the urge, and Ruby waited for the spark that would ignite the deadly combination of loneliness and lust. One Wednesday afternoon, Ruby was peeling a vegetable with a paring knife, thinking about her current situation. She was completely healed now. Stretching every day to regain her range of motion and practicing hand-to-hand combat during her free time, she was back in shape. However, the absence of her weapon was like a hole in her side, exacerbating her pangs of heartache. Alice was a nice friend and all, but Ruby needed something more. Maybe it was time to sever all ties and move on to greener pastures. The door clicked open and Alice stepped in. The weather had been getting colder, and it would probably start to snow soon. She took off her coat and placed it onto the rack. "Ried, I'm Hoami. They let me off early today because of snow warnings," Alice called, taking off her shoes and gloves. "Red." Ruby was suddenly in front of her. "Oh, hey," she said. "I was busy preparing dinner, sorry." Alice was a little unsettled at the way Ruby was staring into her face, as if she were seeing it for the last time and trying to memorize it. After a few seconds, Alice raised her arms to gently push Ruby away, but instead Ruby grabbed them and pulled Alice towards her, wrapping an arm around her back and gripping her shoulder. The paring knife slid out of her sleeve as she moved her other arm behind Alice's neck. Alice didn't notice the knife as she focused intently on Ruby's face. "Red. Snap out of it, let me go." She began struggling a bit, but Ruby kept her grip tight and leaned forward, resting her cheek in the hollow at the base of Alice's throat. Alice froze as Ruby softly breathed in, taking in Alice's scent of grass and rain and warmth. She licked her skin, her rough tongue scraping against the smooth surface, causing Alice to shudder and moan. Moving upwards, she trailed her tongue across her throat and along the side of her jaw, nibbling on her earlobe. Alice melted in her arms, legs trembling and unable to support herself. Red, wait, she said, groaning softly. Ruby stopped and lifted her head up to look into Alice's delicate features. Alice was panting, her breath fogging in the cold air. Raising her knife behind Alice's back, Ruby prepared to slice open the doe's neck and rip off her skin and gain access to her deepest places. She would finally be happy and fulfilled in. With a sudden motion, Alice shifted forwards and kissed her straight on the lips. It was an innocent kiss, one that was somehow chaste yet also stirred up Ruby's deepest passions and ignited a fire in her depths. Letting the blade slip back into her sleeve, she took hold of Alice's face and deepened the kiss, closing her eyes and pulling her closer. Their tongues touched, sliding against each other and making Alice clench Ruby's clothes. Alice tasted like spring and flowers and all that was good and pure. Ruby's chest filled with sudden warmth as she realized that this was what true love was. Dying bodies were incomparable with the feeling of someone returning her love and passion. Now gently grabbing hold of her waist, Ruby picked Alice up and walked over to the bed, Alice's legs wrapped around her own waist. Breaking off the kiss and setting her down gently, Ruby began to undress her, slipping her white gown off and over her head. Alice grabbed her arm. Wait, she said, breathing heavily and staring into Ruby's eyes. I don't think I've ever been attracted to a girl before. Ruby answered by renewing the kiss and pulling down Alice's underclothes, caressing her abdomen before inserting a finger and stroking her wetness. Alice's muffled protests faded as she writhed under Ruby's touch, each stroke bringing her closer to release. Ruby moved to her breasts, swirling her tongue on the tips of the perky mounds and rolling the nubs under her fingers, her ridged fingertips sending tingling feelings into Alice's core. Alice didn't care anymore. She didn't care that she knew next to nothing about who Red was, she didn't care that Red had shown up in bloodstained clothes, she didn't that Red refused to go to the hospital, she had been in love with Red since she had first seen her bloodied and wounded on her doorstep. Now she was lost in lust and could barely think. Giving out mindless little squeaks of pleasure, she came, her wetness spreading over the bedsheets as she clenched around Ruby's fingers and whimpered. Ruby's rhythm never stopped as she continued pumping her fingers in and out, quickly bringing Alice to another orgasm and reducing her to a shuddering mess, Alice's mouth open as she struggled to regain her breath. Ruby leaned in for another kiss and took her soft, pink lip into her mouth, gently biting down on it and stimulating Alice even further. Throughout the rest of the night, Ruby took out her frustrations on Alice's tender, young body, teaching Alice to pleasure her and making love until the first rays of dawn appeared over the horizon. Chapter 9, A Shortage of Time. Ruby stretched and yawned, then went back to cuddling Alice. Wrapping her arms around Alice's chest, she fondled her breasts and planted a kiss on the back of her neck, enjoying the feel of another warm body against hers. Alice murmured and shifted, then fell back asleep. Ruby spent a few more minutes listening to the rhythm of Alice's soft breathing, watching her chest rise up and fall back down with each breath. She didn't know how long this sort of happiness could last, so she intended to savor every last moment. She looked at the clock, wondering how long they had slept. Hey Alice, wake up, you sleepyhead, she whispered. Alice shifted and groaned. UGHH. What time is it? It's already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Come on, let's get dressed and eat some breakfast. I'll walk with you to the medical center. Screw my job, let me sleep. You kept me up the entire night, Alice complained, grabbing the covers and pulling them over her head. Wriggling under the blankets, Ruby planted a kiss on her nose. I'll make some food and you can sleep for a little longer, okay? Making non-committal noises, Alice closed her eyes and went back to sleep. Ruby smiled and got out of bed, getting dressed and pulling open the curtains. After making lunch and sending Alice off to her job, Ruby walked around the house, looking for things to do. Well, the weather's getting colder and it looks like it might snow. Grabbing the axe, Ruby walked towards the edge of the forest to chop some firewood. The fireplace would be a good alternative to the cottage's terrible central heating, especially during the middle of winter. Taking an axe to some small trees at the edge of the forest, Ruby used her aura and spent an hour bucking a full cord of firewood, piling the stack of wood next to her house. Looking happily at the mound of wood, she wondered when she had begun to thinking of the dwelling as not just Alice's home, but also her home. She stood in shock as she realized that she trusted Alice completely and loved her so much that she would do anything for her. Walking back into the emerald forest, Ruby trudged up the hill to the boulder in which she had stored her sign. Fully healed now, Ruby merely hefted another similarly sized boulder and smashed it into the storage boulder, trusting that her weapon was sturdy enough to remain undamaged. The two masses shattered in an ear-splitting explosion, bits and pieces of rubble exploding outwards and bouncing off of Ruby's aura. Striding forward, she picked up her undamaged weapon that was half buried underneath the rubble. Ruby had decided that she trusted Alice enough to bring her weapon into the house. Walking back to the cottage, she reminded herself to ask Alice if she could go buy some dust cartridges and restock her ammo supply. Going back inside the house, she placed the weapon in her closet and put on a thick jacket. She didn't really feel the cold, but the jacket would obscure her features and conceal her identities from any passerby. She then grabbed some lean and locked the door behind her, walking towards town to buy some supplies for the winter and to check out the dust shop. Waiting for Alice outside of the hospital, her arms were laden with shopping bags full of winter provisions of flour, non-perishables, basic explosive dust, and other necessities. She had her hood up and was staring at the sky, watching the snowflakes swirl around her. The hospital doors slid open with a whir as Alice walked out, beginning to shiver as she moved from the comfortable indoor temperature to the freezing temperature outside. Ruby transferred her bags to one arm and took off her jacket, sliding it over Alice's shoulders. Alice looked up gratefully. "Thanks, I didn't think it would be this cold." Ruby smiled and pulled the collar of the jacket up to create a little privacy for themselves as she gave Alice a kiss. Side by side, hand in hand, they headed home together. Ruby and Alice had just walked into the house and shut the door behind them when the walls suddenly shook and a muted roar came from outside. Alice took one glance out the window, told Ruby that she could handle this, and ran into another room to grab her weapon. Ruby desperately wanted to keep her out of danger, but she stifled her protective instincts and told herself that Alice was a big girl and that she could handle this. Alice ran back into the room with an old-fashioned rifle, one with a wood stock and an iron sight. Opening the door slightly, she stuck the barrel outside and aimed, igniting her aura and shrouding herself in a grass-green glow. Pushing a little aura into her weapon and charging up the dust cartridges inside, she placed the Ursa's head into her sights and pulled the trigger. The Ursa had noticed her and had begun charging towards her, but it was only able to take 2 steps before the shot rang out, the mass of green dust entering its head and exploding out the other side. The Ursa teetered and collapsed, falling onto the pile of firewood and scattering wood across the yard. "Darn," said Ruby. "Nice shot, Alice. Hey, do you want to eat the Ursa? It probably makes great steaks." Alice looked a little sick at her suggestion. "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm a deer faunus, remember? Fruits and veggies taste way better to me than tough, bloody flesh." Ruby shrugged. "Each to their own, I guess." Alice watched in awe as Ruby picked up the Ursa and effortlessly slung it across her shoulders. A light red glow surrounded Ruby and bled onto the snow around her as she walked off into the dark copse of trees. Half an hour later, Ruby had dropped the carcass off deep inside the forest to make sure that it wouldn't attract scavengers to the house. Alice had heated up dinner and was setting out plates and utensils. Ruby went to her closet and pulled out her scythe, pulled it into the shotgun form. "Hey Alice, I want to show you something," Ruby called. Alice dried her hands and walked into the living room, where Ruby stood, holding out her shotgun. "Wow, what is that?" she asked, wide-eyed and staring at the red and black object. "It's my weapon," Ruby said with a smile. "I wanted to train to become a huntress, but something got in the way and I had to discard that dream," she finished. Ruby's smile turned a little sad. "Do you want to hold it?" Alice shook her head. "It's really cool and all, but it's sort of giving me the creeps. I like the shape though. Come on, let's go eat dinner." Ruby put the gun back into her closet and walked towards the dining room. As they began to eat, Alice started talking about some news she had heard around work. "I heard some of my coworkers talking about some sort of scythe-wielding murderer," she began. They said that she wears red-black clothing and is completely psychotic. Leaning closer, she whispered to Ruby, and the worst part was, I heard that she dismembered her victims and ate their organs. Ruby had stopped eating and was staring at Alice, but she didn't notice. Alice continued talking. Funny thing, I thought it was you for a sec considering how you showed up out of nowhere. And then I realized that you couldn't possibly be the murderer, she said with an embarrassed smile. For one thing, you're way too nice, and for another, you don't dress in red and black. And, you don't even have a side, she finished. Ruby's head was pounding as she realized how close she had been to being discovered. She couldn't stay here any longer, as the search for her seemed to have been intensified, especially if her searchers had begun releasing information to the general public. Hello, Red. Do you think that I'm weird? Alice asked, ducking her head as her cheeks flushed. They had nearly finished dinner by now. Ruby couldn't wait anymore, she didn't know how long this paradise could last. I think you're perfect, Alice. She got up from her chair and picked Alice up, kissing her deeply. Alice wrapped her legs around Ruby's waist, groaning happily as their tongues swirled. Alice broke off the kiss, protesting. Wait, I have to clean up and do the dishes and MMF. Ruby hungrily kissed her again, savoring her taste. The dishes can wait, Ruby purred, and walked towards their bedroom.